Well, I guess it's the age-old argument of whether, John Maynard Keynes was right in his theory of economics, which basically said, the government should spend to help us get out of recession and sort of ameliorate, those lows in the economy. But other economists argue the problem with politicians running that practice is they're going to spend money on their pet projects and not necessarily on economic stimulus. And have you seen some of that in this package?
Yes, there are clearly inappropriate expenditures in the package. Some have been taken out. In the initial House package, there was money for resodding of the National Mall. I think that was inappropriate. It was derided, and eventually the House leadership took it out. But Mayor Ronald Reagan once said there is nothing so permanent as a temporary governmental program. And I think we have to be very careful about that. Whatever we do should be temporary, should be measured by its effects to stimulate the economy in a timely fashion. Temporary, in a timely fashion, and it should be targeted where we can do the most good. And many economists believe, and I tend to believe, that tax cuts for small business, that is the type of expenditure that will do the most good, because it is small business that creates new jobs in America. And as you point out, we have a high level of unemployment, and we need to create new jobs. What we do not need is massive new federal programs, because they are virtually never temporary. And once we're out of this recession, we have to get back to the basics of balancing the federal budget. I have been critical of my own political party for its over expenditures in this decade. And I have been quite clear that I think a Republican president and a Republican-led Congress spent too much money. But two wrongs do not make a right. Simply because there is now a Democratic president and a democratically controlled Congress does not mean that there should be massive over-expenditures. We have to reform what occurred in the past, and we have to do it in a bipartisan basis. And there should not be pet projects, so-called earmarks, particularly in a stimulus package. And for the regular amount of spending, that should go through the typical appropriations process and not through an accelerated stimulus piece of legislation.
Well, apparently, Japan tried to spend their way out of a deep recession, and some economists say, well, that's just what it does, just lengthen the time that recession existed, instead of just letting maybe being a little bit more targeted and let market forces perhaps play a little bit more into it.
Yes, I think economists agree that the 1990s was, in Japan, a lost decade, and we should learn from the experience of Japan. I recognize we need a stimulus package, and we have to do it in a timely fashion, but we shouldn't engage in massive new programs because, frankly, we are in a critical situation, and we are now being lent money by various other nations in the world, including China and Saudi Arabia and others, and eventually he who pays the piper calls the tune. And we will live in a diminished America, and your children and our 21-year-old son will live in a diminished America unless we get our fiscal house in order. And I really think I was sent to Washington to be part of the solution regarding fiscal issues in this country.
Amazing. You talk about pork, and there's a lot of good causes, but whether or not they belong in a stimulus package or not is I guess, the argument. I read an editorial today. They were talking about the Milwaukee public school systems. There was almost $90 million in there to build more schools, but according to this editorial, they have now 15 vacant schools and declining enrollment. And so I guess my point is, there's a big rush to get this package passed, but if you're spending over $1 trillion with interest and all, shouldn't there be a little bit more thought process put into it? Let it work through the committee process. Try to, sooner the better, I'm sure, but not where it has to be done overnight. Let's have it properly vetted.
obviously, these proposals should be properly vetted, and if they're not part of a targeted stimulus program, they should go through the regular appropriations process and the regular committee process. And the situation of the Milwaukee schools is a situation that, in my judgment, should go through the regular committee process and is not classically defined as stimulus. There are some who think that any spending is stimulus. That is not my view. That is not my view, and I think that is a view that could lead to massive deficits in the future. And so I think we have to be much more targeted, and there shouldn't be pet projects.
Congressman, you mentioned earlier about tax cuts, and I know one of your platforms when you ran for Congress was elimination of the alternative minimum tax.
Yes.
Could you explain to our residents about that? Because I know it does affect a lot of Westfield families.
Yes.
And this was something that started, I think, in the 60s.
Yes.
But was never indexed for inflation, and so now a lot of families are being penalized because of it.